My friends, I'm back. Привет and bonjour and grazie. I hope there are people from Europe watching this as well as in the US. So today we are moving on to Grand Duke Dmitri's diary of 8th January 1906, and we're only doing one diary entry today because it's a relatively long one, but more importantly because tomorrow or in the next episode we'll be touching on a very serious topic about what was going on in Russia at that time with the October Revolution still going on. So this was the October 1905 revolution, in advance of which Dmitri's own uncle, who was raising him, had been killed by a terrorist bomb, and there was horrible bloodshed both in St. Petersburg and especially in Moscow. And it interests me to see how much Dmitri knows about that and what he doesn't know. But that is a topic for tomorrow that I want to spend some time on. And today, the topic is actually about family. So if you put yourself in the place of 14-year-old Dmitri and his 15-year-old sister, you will realize that this was almost a kind of novel concept to them. So they had first been raised by their father, a widower, who did not play a very active role in their life at all. He would usually see them at bedtime and read them a book and put them to bed. And it wasn't that unusual. I have a friend in London who's in his 90s who was raised in an aristocratic family, and he recalls only seeing his mother really once a day and the rest of the time being with the nursery staff. But it so happened that in the Russian imperial family there were at least two big families where the parents took quite an active role and quite an affectionate role with their children, and to some extent put the needs of their children first. And that was definitely a novel concept to Dmitri and Maria, who after their father had been banished from Russia had been raised by an uncle and aunt. And according to Maria, the aunt had never really been affectionate with them. We'll talk more about that as Dmitri mentions her in the diary entries. And the uncle, who could be very affectionate with them, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, and her name was Grand Duchess Elizabeth. The uncle was affectionate, yes, but he was also something of a tyrant. He was the Governor General of Moscow, and he sort of ruled Moscow and his own household with an iron fist, and we'll see some allusions to that in Dmitri's diaries, although, yeah, not so much. I'm not sure that he and his sister really like to talk about that so much. But anyway, so let's talk about these two families who lived in Pavlovsk and Tsarskaya Selo, respectively. And one was the Emperor and Empress's family, and they had at this time 4 little girls, and of course the Tsarevich, the heir to the throne, who was very little at that time and had hemophilia, which really preoccupied his parents, because at that time there was no factor that they could give him. There was no clotting factor, and it was often a terminal disease in childhood. Plus, their 4 daughters were quite a bit younger than Dmitri and Maria, so they couldn't really be peers to them. But the other family, of course, that we've already met were the Konstantinovichi. So we've met that there were 9 children. There was Uncle Kostya, who was Dmitri and Maria's great uncle. There was Aunt Mavra, who was a German princess from Saxe-Altenburg and had married into the Russian imperial family. And there were their 9 children. I believe it was 9. I think maybe one of them died in childbirth. But they were, you could call Grand Duke Constantine, Uncle Kostya, quite an enlightened man by Grand Ducal standards. So much so that he even allowed one of his sons, who was academically gifted, to attend a non-military school, the prestigious Alexander Lycée. And that was really unheard of within the imperial family and bucked tradition, and I think even shocked a few people. But he was himself a very intellectual and cultured man. He was the first man to, I believe, to translate Hamlet into Russian, which was a monumental task. I've never read his translation, but actually I'd like to. And he was a playwright, and he also came from a family that was quite liberal by the standards of the Russian imperial family, and his father, Dmitri's great-grandfather, Grand Duke Constantine Nikolaevich, had been instrumental in freeing the serfs in 1861 and also a moving force in the Russian Great Reforms that had included the judiciary, the educational system, the various branches of the military, and had stopped just short of including the government and the autocracy itself, rather tragically, because it looked like it was heading in that direction. And then Dmitri's grandfather, Alexander II, was killed by terrorists before he could actually enact that reform. So Dmitri lost a lot of relatives to terrorists and then to revolutionaries. So that's something we'll talk about as we go along, and I'm already getting a bit behind here. So for Dmitri and Maria, who'd been basically raised away from their cousins, from their Romanov cousins, and away from other children, and to some extent were precocious little adults, this was quite a novel experience. And Dmitri, I think, was suddenly confronted with this little throng of brothers, the Konstantinovich brothers, and I get the impression, maybe you won't find it so, that he was a little awkward with them, that he was even a little obnoxious, because he didn't really know how to interact with boys his age. I know less about how Maria interacted with girls her age. And the whole thing makes me think of the Tolstoy quote, the classic, one of the classic first lines of great literature about all happy families being alike and every unhappy family being unhappy in its own way. And I think, unfortunately, Dmitri and Maria were on the latter side of that, and now they were seeing what it was like for children who were on the happy side of that. So let's talk about the people who are introduced in this diary entry, and we start out with Miss June, and she was not an English name woman. Her name was not June, June. Her name was Yevdokia, and June was Dmitri's abbreviation for her last name, which was Junkovskaya. And she was about 50 years old at that time, and she was Maria's governess. Neither of the children like her, and you'll see that being shown in several of the diary entries. And Maria writes about it in her memoirs, The Education of a Princess, if you want to know more. It's out of print, but it's pretty readily available. It was a large commercial publisher. So anyway, I'm digressing. So Miss June is maybe you'll share the impression I get from this diary entry is someone who resented a little bit being a second-class citizen. She was surrounded at all times by the members of the Russian imperial family, but she wasn't usually included, even though she was a gentlewoman and an educated woman. And it seems that in her case, maybe that was resented a little bit. Whereas I get the impression that with General Laming and his wife, Maria Nikolaevna, they didn't seem to care whether they were invited to things or not. So juxtaposed to these two families with multiple children of the Emperor and Empress and the Konstantinovichi, we have Dmitri and Maria in their own little household with 3 adults, Miss June and the Lamings. The Lamings were in their early 40s, mid 30s, respectively. And the 3 of them together, even though technically Miss June was attached to Maria and the Lamings were attached to Dmitri, nonetheless, the 3 of them together were all cooperatively raising the children and interacting with them. So there wasn't a harsh dichotomy between the 2 households. Excuse me. So the Konstantinovichi, we've met 3 of the children. We've met the oldest 2 boys, Ioan and Gavril, who were, 19 and 18 years old at the time, and we've met I'm sorry, I need to mention that. We met Princess Tatiana, and the reason Ioan and Igor, we get to Igor later, Ioan and Gavril and Tatiana and their siblings were not Grand Dukes and Grand Duchesses was because Emperor Alexander III had drawn a line in the sand. They were getting the Grand Dukes at that time were having large families for the most part. And so he said, we can't have dozens of Grand Dukes and Grand Duchesses. We need to limit that. So previously, if you were in the royal line, you were pretty much entitled to be a Grand Duke or a Grand Duchess, but Alexander changed the law so that if you were the son or daughter or the grandson or granddaughter of a Grand Duke, of an emperor, then you got the title. So Dmitri was the grandson of Alexander II. Dmitri and Maria were the grandchildren of an emperor. The Konstantinovich children were not. They went back to Nicholas I, who was their great-grandfather, so they didn't qualify. And if there had been no revolution, and if Dmitri had had children in Russia as a Russian Grand Duke, his children would not have been Grand Dukes and Grand Duchesses. They would have been princes and princesses, just like the Konstantinovich cousins. So it looks like this particular episode is going to be a bit longer because a lot to fill in, and so I hope that's all right. So here is Dmitri in this diary entry trying to interact with his cousins, and as you'll see, he is sort of making fun of one of the older boys, the 19-year-old Ioan, which probably wasn't appreciated by Ioan, and he was being rough with the younger boys. And so this was probably kind of a learning experience for him. Okay, and he uses a racial slur in this diary entry, which I am not going to say, although when the translation of the diaries, the English translation of the diaries are published, that will be included. And if you're curious about it, you can see what it actually was. All right, so let's start. January 8th, I was in church and then at a rather boring Sunday lunch. It was a lot of fun last night at dinner. We laughed a lot. After dinner, we went to look at the children's rooms. Gavril said such absurd things to me that I laughed terribly. In the afternoon, we went back to Pavlovsk and walked to the farm where we drank coffee with very tasty buttered rolls. But what spoiled the pleasure a little was that Uncle Kostya invited Miss June to come with us to the farm. She, of course, immediately agreed and was very puffed up about it. On the drive there, I stood on the footman's step. So to interject, he was riding where the footman usually stood on the back of a carriage, which I think any child would have enjoyed. It's terribly fun. On the walk to the farm, I pushed Oleg and Igor into the snow. They were, I believe, how old were they? 13 and 11 years old. So he was older than them. I pushed them into the snow, and it ended with Oleg running up behind me and pushing me so hard that I fell to the ground. So the 11-year-old gave him sort of a taste of his own medicine. Let's see. Aunt Mavra came to the farm with Baroness Korff. On the way back, Ioan displayed his intellectual abilities, Dmitri here being sarcastic. For example, he did not know what a wind-up horse was, or a butcher, or a lapel, or a racial slur, and so on. In short, it was so funny that I laughed uproariously the whole time. We are having dinner today at the Nicholas Palace. Misha will probably be there because he's leaving for Gatchina to serve, so this will be our last dinner together. I'm going to go change my clothes and read the... And here he uses a lowercase word that Amen, A-M-E-N, but it is an abbreviation, I believe, and I don't know exactly what he's referring to. Maybe, it was Sunday, so maybe some kind of devotional thing. There's a pause at that point, and then he resumes after dinner. I'm back from dinner. We talked about various things. After dinner, I played Halma with Aunt Alex. Naturally, she won. I'm going to bed now. I have to write Aunt tomorrow. Lessons start up again tomorrow. So the Christmas holiday was over. I believe Halma was a card game, and as you recall from one of the previous entries, Dmitri also lost very badly when he was playing Bezik with Maria Nikolaevna Laming. So he always took it in stride when he lost anything, whether it was polo or golf or a card game. The only time he didn't really take it in stride is when he was an adult, and he, after the revolution, ended up being something of a problem gambler and lost thousands and thousands of dollars or various currencies without really being able to afford that. And so that was easy. That was not so easy to just shrug his shoulders at. So, you could say maybe he should have taken the hint when he was a child that he didn't have much luck when it came to card games. So let's see, a couple things. One thing I missed, Misha. We've met him before. He was the Tsar's younger brother, Mikhail Alexandrovich, and he is going to Gatchina the next day because that is where his regiment is and where he lived, I think, most of the time. At least he did later in his life. And he is this man in his 20s who Dmitri so far seems to really look up to. Although they would have some issues later. I think I mentioned that before. Let's see, is there anything else I missed? Aunt Mavra, did I use her name? She was Uncle Kostya's wife. And Baroness Korff was a lady-in-waiting. The three things that Ioan did not know, I suppose it was a credit to Ioan and his parents that he didn't know this racial slur. And the other things, they're so odd. He didn't know what a wind-up horse was. I'm not sure what a wind-up horse is. A toy, I guess. I hope I translated that right. A butcher or a lapel. And I don't know if these are double entendres or if Ioan literally didn't know what a butcher was or what a lapel was. I guess he would mostly have been wearing military uniforms. So your guess is as good as mine on that one. But Dmitri probably seemed quite obnoxious because he was laughing his head off. And he had a tendency to do that. In fact, he seems to have had kind of laughing fits where he wasn't maybe completely in control of that. So is there anything else? I think that is about it. It does make me laugh a little bit at this contrast between the Dmitri that we encountered in a previous entry, who was being the little adult and actually giving his woodworking teacher some Madeira because his woodworking teacher had a kind of almost fainting fit at the sight of blood when George Laming was cut while doing woodworking. So there's that little adult Dmitri, and then in this diary entry you see the boy who's roughhousing with his cousins and having a really good time with them. So that's it for today. Tomorrow we're on to this very big and interesting topic of the 1905 revolution. And this was not the Bolshevik Revolution. The October Revolution 1917 was the Bolshevik Revolution. This was the October 1905 revolution, and I better stop or I'll launch into that. So I hope that you will come back, and thanks for watching. Bye.